Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Bourne. I'm talking through a little bit of chapter 4 from the Hoffman text, Good Game. And I'm going to present a little bit of a file. And this file is out available on Google Drive. So you could actually, I'll make it, yeah, it's available on Google Drive. So I can send the link out there. But really, what we're looking at here, so we've been talking about sports fans, we've been talking about the spirituality of sports, and can sports lead to spiritual insights? Can you get better at sports by doing some spiritual practice? And so now we're circling back to kind of bringing us up to the present. And so with the relationship between religion and sports in the United States, and and really focusing on the turn of the century into turn from the 19th into the 20th century, actually. And so it's where we have sports kind of doing a 180 with its relationship with religion, 180-degree turn. And so you had, remember, when we're talking about the Puritans, and you might have answered questions on the midterm about this, we're talking about the Puritans. There was not, because of their focus on work, and because of the focus on predestination, and because of the focus on the theological ideas of the separation of the body and the soul, and anything that elevates the body necessarily denigrates the soul. Okay, so we have some theological ideas that are prevalent in American Protestantism, and at that time, that's pretty much what you had in the United States. Catholics were a small minority; they were looked down upon. You didn't have a whole lot of other religions making their way in the 1800s or so, and so you pretty much had a Protestantism. People read. People learned how to read, reading the Bible. The Bible was read in public schools. You didn't have the strict separation of church and state. Even you couldn't even be Catholic and running for office, running for any kind of political office. And so there was a lot of where Protestantism was sort of like it was the religion. I mean, there was still a little bit of religious freedom, but it's for a different class. So you have the Puritans, especially up in the Northeast. Where they have a very strong influence, and then you have the Baptists in the South, and the Baptists were really turned off by sport, again, because anything that elevates the body denigrates the soul, and so you have these theological ideas, again, the duality of body and soul, the focus on predestination, and the intent spent on work, because if you work and you're successful, that is evidence that you're going to get into heaven. So, 6-day work week. And so they didn't want to get people tired by going out and playing all these sports on the one day off. It really was for recovery. So we then move into the late 1800s, early 1900s, and it just flips on its head. And there's a couple of theological ideas that were pertinent during this time, and that were really strong during this time, that had a direct impact of the way that sports and religion interact with one another, and the allowance of sports to become and permeate, to become prevalent within culture, and to actually permeate all aspects of culture. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today in this recording. Hopefully, I can keep it to about 15 minutes or so. But really, it just gives you an overview. And you can listen to this. We can save some time before class tomorrow. So, at the turn of the century, the Protestant prohibition against playing sports began to wane. And so what you have a couple of different things going on, not just even within theology, but you have what's called the rise of rationalism. And the rationalism, essentially, it was this notion that we're all thinking beings. And so we don't just, if you want to know how to do something, if you want to know whether or not you should do X, Y, and Z, you can think it through yourself. You don't have to go to a pastor. You don't have to check with your religion. But we are rational beings. And so the rise of this rationalism was really, really prevalent, and really started to have an impact on how people saw their religion. And so it wasn't just they could start making their own decisions. They became autonomous. Okay, so the rise of rationalism really began to play a role, and people were saying, well, it's not that bad playing sports. It's not that bad. So I can still go to church and play sports. So even if my pastor says it's terrible, it's like I don't really believe him anymore. So, and so the resistance to watching and playing sports on Sunday even began to erode. And so it wasn't just this notion of you can't do anything on Sunday anymore. And so people started watching sporting events. There was much more of a demand. You can see some teams were allowed to play baseball on Sundays, but the music had to be church music, and that's where like the organ actually music started to come in. So the South took longer to adopt this embrace of the amusement, but by 1924, the religious leaders were encouraged to take advantage of the sports for the youth in the summer months. And so we're going to talk about the YMCA, and the YMCA comes to light during this time as well. It comes out of England into the United States, and religious leaders actually saw the YMCA as an opportunity to reach young men. It is called the Young Men's Christian Association. It's not, if you go out there and you look today, you look at their mission, you don't see a whole lot relationship with that today. But it was started called the Young Men's Christian Association, and it actually didn't even start as an athletic pursuit. It was more a place to read, talk, play cards, play chess, these sorts of things. And so it was only later on did sports become, and we'll talk about muscular Christianity and that relationship. So anyway, so this 180-degree turn was remarkable. In a little over 50 years, Protestants went from a strict ban on sports and music to encouraging the Protestant colleges to incorporate sports into the curriculum. Okay, so how did this happen? Two key ideas that we're first going to talk about. One, you have this revolution in moral philosophy, and two, you have the ideals of perfectionism and post-millennial eschatology popularized in revivalism. What on earth does that mean? And we'll break that down. Okay, so let's tackle this first one first. Make sense. Okay. So a revolution in moral philosophy. Again, these are theological ideas prevalent in the religions that have a direct impact on the way that the culture interacts with sports. Okay, so that's why these theological ideas are so important for us to understand during this time. Okay, so up until this time, Scripture was authoritative, taken literally, and only the guide for life. Salvation was only accessible through Jesus Christ. Okay, virtue was fruit of the election, like John Edwards talking about, again, like if you're part of this elect. Okay, there was no universal moral sense. Humans could only aspire to virtuous living through the grace of God. Okay, but what you start having to happen, and because you have universities, what do people do at universities? They read, they get new ideas. They're exposed to other cultures, to other ways of thinking, not just pastors. And so even though you have these religious universities, these were all started by religious organizations. Harvard, Brown, Yale, Princeton, Duke even was called Trinity. All of these institutions started by religious organizations, but what's going on in them, okay, is you have this idea of what's called theistic common sense, okay, or this evangelical enlightenment. And so what it does is it elevates the human mind to saying that we're pretty good at thinking about things. We don't just have to be told what to do. We can think these problems through on our own. And so you have this capacity for moral and ethical living, aside from strictly following the Bible. Okay? And so you also have a decrease in somewhat of a decrease in the acceptance of what's called biblical literalism, where of not just taking the Bible as word for word in a literal fashion. And so there's much more of a liberal theology in play of saying like, okay, what's the main message of the Bible is? Well, it's to be a good person, is to love Jesus. It's not necessarily to follow every law to the T. You can't live that way. Okay, so if you open the book of Leviticus, it's an instruction manual, and you can't, in the Old Testament, you can't do that. So you can't live that way. Anyway, so what we can do is this moral sense of the humans, and this is on page 104. This moral sense of the humans can be discovered away from religious authority. So we can start on our own. We can start figuring out what is good for us, what is bad for us, and what is going to get us into heaven. We don't just have to follow what the pastor says. Okay, so people started appealing to their own moral compass and not only to authority. The pressure to act morally was shifted to us, the person, the individual. Okay? And so this individualized autonomy. It's like, I'm the one that's in control. I'm the one that controls my own salvation. Okay, so acting morally can be discovered through the use of reason. Okay, so you have this notion of we can start determining what is good for us away from away from the pastor, away from the authority of Scripture, the authority of the pastor. Okay, and so and the Enlightenment had something. This is coming off the Enlightenment. In French, the rationalism coming over from France, with a lot of people coming over from Europe. Okay, so it's again, as we noted, more and more people are becoming educated. More and more people are reading. They're reading the Bible on their own. They're coming to their own conclusions. Okay, so you have this revolution in moral philosophy that has a direct impact on how we perceive sports to interact with culture and whether or not we can participate in sports. Okay, so that's the first one. The second big key theological idea is during this time is this push of revivalism, perfectionism, and millennialism. Okay, I think I showed some pictures of the revival meetings for William James. This is going all the way back to, again, you have itinerant preachers that are going around and they're having revival meetings. And so you have huge, it's called the Second Great Awakening, huge movements of people going to these revivals and cohorting with one another and getting preached to, but a wide variety, okay? A wide variety of things. So in one sense, you have this notion of revivalism. Okay. So what are these other ideas? Okay. You have perfectionism. Okay. Well, let's look at the millennialism first. Okay. So what millennialism is, there's premillennials, there's postmillennials, but really the idea of millennialism, okay, is that Christ is going to return after 1,000 years of peace and social harmony. Okay. So how does this play into our responsibility? Okay. So the idea with millennialism is that we human beings have a responsibility to create this perfect world of this peace and social harmony, because that will usher in the return of Christ when Christ says he will come again. Okay, the millennialists will believe that there is a 1,000-year time of peace and social harmony, and then Christ will return, and everything will be saved. You'll have, people, he'll raise the dead, he'll obliterate sin. Okay, it'll be a pretty good time. Okay, for Christians who think this. Okay, so then there's premillennialists, and premillennialists argue it's like there's actually going to be Christ will come, and then there's 1,000 years. There's postmillennialists, is like, well, 1,000 years. Oh no, Christ will come, then you'll have 1,000 years. Premillennialists, you have 1,000 years of actually strife and struggle. So there's a lot of different. But for millennials, okay, think of a millennial, 1,000 years of peace and shalom, and then Christ will come again. So we have to participate in that. There is, like, the clock is ticking. And so we need to participate in making this world a more peaceful world, a more social world. And so it's not just about, and this kind of like leads into the social gospel movement. It's not just about making sure everyone adheres to the teachings. If we think about the difference between orthodoxy and orthopraxis, I can even type that in here. So orthodoxy, okay. Orthodoxy is believing the right thing. Okay. So it's not just about believing the right thing, but it's also about orthopraxis, which is like just doing the right thing. Okay. So you have that's millennialism, and the revivalism, and so this is becoming big. And then perfectionism, the idea of the conversion can lead to a sanctified and nearly perfect spiritual moral life. Okay, and so you can do this through any means necessary. You try to convert through any means necessary. You try to preach the gospel through any means necessary. What is a great way to talk about the gospel to young men and women? Sports. And so vehicles like the YMCA, vehicles like even today, Catholic Crusade for Catholic Crusade. Athletes are the CCA. I forget what it says. So, but you have, I think, I have one of the other pages in here. The Promise Keepers, the Promise Keepers, and kind of taking this notion, and it's like, we're going to keep these promises and be okay. All these different kind of organizations use, okay, the vehicle. Okay, you need a vehicle to preach the gospel to people who might not be receptive to sitting down and reading them the Bible. Okay? And so how could you do that? Well, you can use the vehicle of sports. And so it opened up sports to be a utilitarian vehicle of a way of spreading the gospel, to bringing about the social change that's necessary to bring about, the second coming of Christ. Okay, so we have these two huge sort of like theological shifts: this change in moral philosophy, and then this advancement of perfectionism, millennialism, and revivalism. Okay, so those two things, they really, it was, I can't overstate how important these theological shifts were for this 180 happening, in the way that, especially in the South, how they started embracing sports and using sports instead of just saying, "Don't touch it with a 10-foot pole." Actually, that I don't know, that might be a sport, not touching things with a 10-foot pole. Anyway, okay, moving on. Okay, so sport play and the social gospel. So you have another thing going on, what's called the social gospel movement. The social gospel, it means like it's not just about religious reform, and so this is where you have Dorothy Day, and you have other kind of social movements as well, where you have you have to get people in a position of health, get people in a position of having food on the table, of having, and so the Goodwill, the Salvation Army, all of these things, and so you can't really just focus on their people's spirituality. Okay, so secular reform and social reform movement, ministering to the needs of the whole person and not just spiritual as before. Okay. And so it's not just about the spiritual needs of the individual, but the whole person. They have to be fed. They have to be nurtured. They have to be cared for. They have to be clothed. They have to have shelter. Okay. And so the social gospel movement says we need to fix those problems just as much as we need to fix the spiritual problems. Okay. So it's a really, really important idea. So it's intent on bringing about reforms in the larger culture, the perfectibility of humanity, elimination of inequities, and improvement of society were the fundamental goals of the social gospel movement. This is often over doctrine or piety. So instead of having just believe this, believe this, believe this, instead it was, how can we help you just become a better person? Okay. Okay. Sports plays into this through this transformation of culture as a tool through which to engage youth and others. Work week hours went down with the Industrial Revolution. More free time anyway for leisure. Okay. Play was a mental and social release from the industrial complex. If you've ever read Uptown Sinclair's The Jungle, it's that, or some other books about, just like the work hours and the Chicago stockyards. I mean, just awful. Okay, and so, but when you have the Industrial Revolution, you have a little bit more free time. Again, we're talking about early 1900s, late 1800s. Okay. Play was a mental and social release from the industrial complex, and oftentimes companies had their own baseball teams, they had their own football teams, and so companies were embracing this too. We're embracing sports as well. You can talk about Horace Bushnell. Religion even is a form of play. He really promoted this. These are some theory, or some preachers from the time. Play is impulsive and inspired rather than driven, joyful rather than disciplined, is the highest state of mankind. This is a religious preacher saying this. Washington Gladden, recreation is indispensable to human health. Why would God make this sinful? Sports can be part of the Christian duty. And Washington Gladden really picks up this notion about sports being part of the Christian duty. And you can use this as a tool, as a way to create a healthy lifestyle, a healthy mind, healthy individuals, a good society. It's not just about the Bible anymore. Okay, so at the turn of the century, starting in the 1860s, we begin to see the churches building tracks, gyms, training rooms, and the formation of church sports teams and leagues. Sports could work their magic only if they were overseen by the churches. Sports could even divert people away from sin by keeping them busy, especially the youth. And that's where we get to the YMCA. I'm going to show you a clip about the YMCA first thing in class, about the history, but really, it's a crucial part, and I have a quiz question about a couple quiz questions about the YMCA. But both chapters really deal with the YMCA and the emergence of that. But it is a way to engage the entire person in that. And so what that does is that opens up the door for churches to start having sports teams, start having sports leagues. People were demanding it more. They weren't saying it's like we're going to do sports instead of religion. Okay, so it's not like it's not an instead of, it's not an either or. Okay, but they said religion can be part of the sporting complex, and they did, and they became part of it. And then we're going to get into, okay, well, what happens when sports becomes too dominant? That we're going to talk about that in class this week and next week, and that's the next chapter. But when you start having some religions kind of subverting themselves, and you see that a little bit, you start seeing, with football games, with colleges especially, starting to see that if you want to be good at sports, there's some underbelly there. There's some ugliness that you might have to partake in. And is that kind of going against the grain? And so that's when you start seeing this dichotomy of like, well, if you focus only on sports, there's going to be an underbelly, and you can't do it at the same time. It can't be religious and play sports. But at this time, a lot of the religions did a 180, saying yes, sports are good. Sports are good for the mind, for the soul. And remember these theological shifts: the more change in moral philosophy, the perfectionism, revivalism, and millennialism. And then all of that is pushing along with this social gospel movement, where it's focusing not just on the spiritual aspect, but on the whole person. And so sports comes into that as well. And you get institutions like the YMCA, you get colleges, you get churches having sports teams, all of these things. And so you start having more of this harmony between religion and sports that we will see rupture in just a few decades. So with that, have a great day. Sorry, I went a little bit long, but it gives you a nice overview, and yeah, we'll talk to you soon.